Welcome, folks, to The Uncommon Good with Bo Bonner and Dr. Bud Marr. Every week, diving deep into the truth of Catholic social teaching and restoring all things in Christ.
The Uncommon Good is on the air. I'm Bo Bonner.
I'm Dr. Bud Marr.
We're coming to you from these United States of America, here in the middle of the country, Iowa Catholic Radio! All sorts of ways that you can be a part of that's part of the great sound effects that we have going here. We want to thank Mercy College of Health Sciences, who underwrites our show over at Mercy, where I am the Senior Advisor for Mission Initiatives and the Director for the Center for Human Flourishing. Bud, what do you do over at the old college?
So, Dean of Liberal Arts and Sciences, if you've ever been interested in liberal arts, which I do love, deep place in my heart for liberal arts. So I work with the humanities side of the college here, sciences, so the really foundational courses, as our students head into all those important professional programs, sonography, radiological technologist, nursing. We have a nursing program.
I've heard about that. No, but actually this works out with what we're gonna be talking about at St. Augustine. So to have a dean of liberal arts and sciences, that's right up St. Augustine's alley. So when we're talking about the confessions, you're speaking from experience there.
Love the confessions. I think this is an appropriate timing for this new initiative that we're kicking off, talking about different books. And you start with Augustine, not only because one of the great theologians and philosophers of the Christian West, but also his name begins with A.
There you go. So
we'll end with Zeno. Or Zeno X?
No, I think Zeno's Z. We'll find a Z. Not Zarathustra, but we'll find a Z. So, but no, thank you, Mercy College, mchs.edu. Thank you, as always, for underwriting our show. Bud, we gave away the ghost a bit. Yeah. We're starting a new radio reading roundup. So I think that, reading group, because, book club, maybe we'll do essays and stuff like this, but to be able to read with folks on air, what we wanted to tell people this, right? We're not trying to say, this is factoids or trivia that you need to know. We're going to read and hopefully just dork out on air so that you realize that dorking out about the books that we're going to look into, the essays, the works, are very much worth dorking out about as well. Because really, Bud, that's what this in the end is about. Not so much giving you factoids where you could pass a test on anything that we're going to talk about, but that you might fall in love with the works of saints, certainly with St. Augustine, but these other things that we're going to read that I think we've promised, even if we read quote-unquote opponents to the faith, to learn to love wrestling with even our enemies. We're supposed to love our enemies, Bud, for the sake of understanding their arguments so that we might love God more and be able to help those who might hold positions contrary to the church. But love is actually what governs this sort of learning that we hope to share with everybody here on air.
No, I think this is great, and I hope it's a service to our listeners. Selfishly, I want to believe that's the case, because if you love dorking out, you can dork out as part of our radio community, and you can email Bo and myself, and probably mostly me, and tell me where I got a specific book wrong. But if, dorking out about books is not your thing, or if, a lot of us, it's hard to carve out as much time as you want to dive into some of these books, the great thing about this is we wrestle with them ourselves. We distill down what we see as some of the most important quotes or ideas, and then you can listen as you're on the elliptical, as you're walking the dog, as you're grilling out in the backyard. We'll deliver it on a silver platter, and then I know Bo says it's not about trivia, but you can take this to the next barbecue and just start dropping truth bombs about St. Augustine's Confessions.
I am imagining someone on the elliptical walking their dog on another elliptical while also grilling and then doing trivia. You can do a lot. That might all be pretty dangerous, especially with the dog and the fire involved. But the point being is, because it's audio and because either you're listening live or you can listen to the podcast, we're hoping it's something that can fit into a niche you find in your day. So for the sake of learning to love learning, or loving learning, learning to love learning, the desire for God and the love of learning. That's a book that I'm stealing from. That is elemental to our faith. You don't have to learn at a, so to speak, academic level. Again, this is not a matter of trying to, get a master's degree by checking in online, but that we learn to love our faith through the way in which these authors and artists allow us to chew on it, to chew on these great ideas together, bud. That's what I'm hoping that we can do going forward. We're doing that with St. Augustine's Confession here on The Uncommon Good. This is Bo Bonner and Dr. Bud Marr. Stick around. We'll be back with St. Augustine's Confessions. We're back with The Uncommon Good. Bo Bonner, Dr. Bud Marr, joining you this week. Thank you for listening to the show. All the myriad ways you can do so, whether that's live on Iowa Catholic Radio, as you hear it through the airwaves, on iowacatholicradio.com or the Iowa Catholic Radio app, or all our good listeners who join us through podcast. Welcome. We're glad to have you on the show. So, Bud, as we alluded to, we're stepping off into new territory. We're doing Ye Old Book Club, but Radio Book Club, which hopefully... we didn't even call it book club. We said reading club, right? We are, of course, starting with a book. We're starting with Augustine's Confessions. For several reasons, I think, wouldn't you say? On one hand, it is sort of a mainstay on Catholic reading lists. It also, in many ways, marks out not the patristics in general. There's clearly people will call what happens after Augustine the patristics, but there's many ways that his confessions mark a direction that Christianity has now put a sort of definitive stamp on the way some literary productions would be done. Clearly, some people who think like, oh, I'm going to read like an autobiography are going to be surprised, Bud, because a lot of this is just straight up theology. But I do think this idea of looking inside myself, telling you about what happened to me, and then thinking about it in terms of a narrative arc that has a purpose, what would eventually end up in the modern memoir. I think it starts here. I don't even think the Gospels or the Old Testament scriptures, I don't think there's much in the ancient world that's quite like this. And so I think it makes sense that for a reading list where we start to think a very particular Christian impact on what books or literature or even the idea of autobiography, memoir, the Confessions look like, it really does start with Augustine in a very particular way.
Well, let me lead with a difficult question for you. And I pose these when I don't want to answer them myself. But so Augustine, clearly one of, if not the greatest theologian of the Christian West, wasn't born into the faith. He converted later in life and actually flirted with like Manichaeism or these different philosophies. Spent some time living with a woman and had a concubine, had difficulty like practicing chastity. That kind of held him back for a time, just in terms of coming into the Catholic Church. But, like I said, one of the greatest theologians of the West. For myself, okay, I will venture an opinion. I would say maybe the greatest. So St. Thomas Aquinas, just preternaturally brilliant. And whenever I need an answer to a question about the faith, I generally turn to his books on my shelves. But I feel like Augustine, it's kind of like the Beatles in rock and roll. Like, I would rather personally listen to Led Zeppelin, but without the Beatles, there's no Led Zeppelin. He's so foundational, but he does get some shade, I think. So Thomas Aquinas, there are like people who want to be cool, like in theological circles, who like, I don't like Thomas, and they're like, Thomists are jerks or something like that, So, it's not that no one theologically is generally free of criticism, but Augustine does get some shade, even from Catholics who I know and respect, for like some of his writings against Pelagius on free will, or like how he treats predestination. If you isolate those from the rest of his writings, it wouldn't be maybe like the tack that I would initially like take. And really, so part of the reason I'm saying this is the Protestant reformers, they really did like Augustine, and so they ignored much of the early church, but they said we're the true Augustinians or whatnot. But if your house was burning and your house had all the books in the world and you could save Augustine's works or Thomas Aquinas's.
Oh, wow. So,
what do you grab?
First of all, before I even get to that, I have to work up to that one, man. That's quite a question. On one hand, it's certainly the case, for instance. So Thomas, of course, has positions that the church didn't end up agreeing with. Very famously, the Immaculate Conception. Although, when you sort of dive into that one, man, he's really close to the Immaculate Conception, and there's sort of just like things that the people believed in the Middle Ages that I'm sure Thomas, presented with the evidence we have now about gestation in the womb, for instance, would go ahead with the church. It's very much the case, though, that Augustine straight up holds positions late in his life, for instance, that the church later condemns. And so Augustine wrote so much and sort of had such a well-documented breadth of the growth of his thought that it is certainly the case that Augustine, rightly from the church, catches heat because he holds positions in certain works that we no longer do, for instance. Also want to quibble just a little bit. You're right, Augustine was not baptized into the faith. His mom, however, was Catholic from the very beginning of his life, and so he was very familiar with the faith. You can argue about what that meant. His dad, for instance, was not, and so that had a big, we'll read going through the Confessions, you'll see how that has to go. So if you're saying in a burning house, what would you do? Would you take Augustine or Thomas? The cheating way to say this is Thomas quotes Augustine a lot. So if you took Thomas, you'd have a lot of Augustine. But if you were saying you could take the totality of the works, you could either grab all of Thomas or all of Augustine. All of Augustine has so much different genres. So, for instance, his commentary on the Psalms alone, for instance, probably vindicate taking him, just like you said, because of how instrumental they are in, you're not going to be able to derive Thomism from Augustine because, you have to, there's more Aristotle, for instance. But yeah, man, I think technically you have to take Augustine and work up to Thomas, as much as I probably side with Thomas more than Augustine with things. But one more thing I want to say, because you brought up the rock and roll stuff, I do think it's really apt to say that Augustine's something like the Beatles, where it's just impossible in the West to not see him in some way in nearly anything going forward. But I, being the jerk that I like to, I always like to point out to people that the Beatles are very important, but I argue that Buddy Holly, right, like rock and roll doesn't exist without Buddy Holly. I don't think Augustine in the West exists without Jerome, strangely enough. Even if, like, there's just no Vulgate without him. And then I'm starting to dork out about, like, well, who's Ambrose in rock and roll and back and forth. And what I do think is interesting, if you go back to that sort of stuff, before that, there's like, who's Elvis, right? And then you're going back into sort of silly notions like that. And then you get into patristics. At any rate, Bud, you just created an entire other radio program we can do. But when you come to this reading, the reason it's important to sort of grapple with this before we actually start reading Augustine, it's not only his importance sort of in Western thought, but particularly the Confessions, which I think, you're a Newman scholar. There is no John Henry Newman being the person of importance he is, except for the genre of conversion diary, as it were, that starts with Augustine, even though Augustine himself, which I think will be very clear in the introduction, is not what he set out to do, but by the end of it, he did.
Yeah, and it truly is an amazing work. So if listeners want to dive into a book from Augustine, the temptation is to maybe turn to the City of God because it's so important and truly an amazing work. It's intimidating if you pick it up at your local bookstore. It could really serve as a doorstop. It's a massive volume, and Augustine tackles a lot. But the Confessions truly is an approachable work. Now, in saying that, I have to warn folks, when you get to book 9 and on, Augustine gets into biblical interpretation, and he says he's gonna work through part of the Bible. He really doesn't get past the first part of Genesis. But that part is very subtle, and he has these, I actually wrote a paper on it back in the day, this whole reflection on time, and really still one of the most important essays on the philosophy of time that we have. But the book itself, the first part of it, so books 1 through 8 are about his life, and this is great. I think to kick us off, Bo, you really start with the beginning. So if the listeners could stick with me for just a moment, this is the first paragraph of the book and just essential for what follows. Great are you, Lord, and exceedingly worthy of praise. Your power is immense and your wisdom beyond reckoning. And so we humans who are a due part of your creation long to praise you. We who carry our mortality about with us carry the evidence of our sin, and with it the proof that you thwart the proud. Yet these humans do part of your creation as they are, still long to praise you. Here's the key quote, and you'll hear it in a lot of places. You arouse us so that praising you may bring us joy, because you have created us and drawn us to yourself, and our hearts are restless until they rest in you. So Augustine says from the very beginning that we were created to know, love, and praise God. And, like our hearts will be restless. They'll be constantly searching. Now I'm thinking of U2 songs. Until they rest in God. And so the rest of the book, Bo, is in some ways, so Augustine, even the title is a play on the word confession, because confession, like its basic meaning can be like, I'm telling you the story of my life, but it also does have a confessional element, like the way we think about the word confession sacramentally in the church. And what Augustine's wrestling with in the rest of the book is, if God has created us for himself and our hearts are restless, like this is the purpose of our creation, how could he have gone astray for so long? Like it's really the mystery of iniquity, and kind of like this journey where he's searching for God, can't find him, and he's reflecting or confessing that for the good of the reader.
But I think that's exactly right. One of the things that people, it gets into the point about, of course, things are in English and how do we render, Latin, etc. But this idea about there's two types of confessions. On one hand, I confess to you, God, what have I done wrong? And he even in this very first part, there's one of the notes I took. It's where he straight up goes, I've strayed and I want to go back to you. So there's a way in which you can almost imagine like, oh, he was going to write a confession. But then, of course, there's the confession of one's life, so to speak. I'm going to confess what you've done in my life. But what I like to take from the intro, one sentence, if people ask, what is this about? The sentence I would choose goes, is there any room in me for you, Lord my God? Is there any room in me for you, Lord my God? It's shortly after what you read. He gets in, so he starts off with what you said, that paragraph or so, where we get, our hearts are restless until they rest in thee, which is probably the most quoted part of Augustine. Makes a lot of sense, right? But then he starts asking a lot of questions, and I think that's what's interesting about what we might think is happening if we hear, oh, you're going to read a confession, or that you're going to read something that is based in a spiritual autobiography. You think he's going to immediately go, oh, I'm like this, and this is what's going to happen, or you like this. But he just starts peppering us with questions like a 4-year-old. Are you like this, God? Are you like that? And then he starts even talking about the paradoxes of what it means to believe in God. You are angry, but your heart is not distilled, right? You change your mind. What is it? You change your works, but not your plan. And he gets into these paradoxes and like, so what are you like, Lord? What are you like? And then he nails that question. Well, let me back up. He even starts to go these big philosophical questions like, God, the whole creation is contained in you, right? Because you created everything. But does that mean every bit of creation has you? Does that mean part of you exists? So he gets into these sort of unanswered philosophical questions, but it leads to that one, Bud. Is there any room in me for you, my Lord, my God? To my mind, Bud, that explains the entirety of the rest of what he's confessing. Is there any room in my heart, which by proximity, right, he's asking the reader, is there any room in you for God? And where would God fit in? And so he's a masterful rhetorician. We're going to have many, many episodes in this work to point out where he trashes rhetoric, but does so with like the most beautiful rhetoric maybe people have ever written in the, I guess I'd call this the Silver Age of Latin. So it's interesting that he asks this question, but makes you ask it. So, I'm just asking basic 4-year-old questions. Lord, if you contain everything, does that mean you're a part of everything? But then he gets to, can you fit in me? Is there a place in me that has room for you? Which can sound like a little kid question, but then, of course, it's the most profound mystical question. If God is within us, where is he within us and how? And then the whole rest of this work, Bud, is a rumination not only on how is it that God is interior to anyone, but then Augustine asks it in his specific life, where did I make room for you, God, and where didn't I at various times in my life? It's a brilliant, succinct way to sort of bury the lead. And I think Augustine does this quite a bit, where he seems to be worried about some practical matter, but he's always hinting at a much deeper one, which would make sense from the guy who eventually came around to reading the Bible because he learned to read it allegorically, which is not to say, which I think sometimes people misunderstand, that like, what he's saying is don't worry about the practical sense, only care about this mystical deep one. For him, they sort of mutually entertain each other, and so he sees his life as an example allegorically of the most deep question. is there any room in me for you, Lord my God?
Well, another question he wrestles with, and if you grew up in the Christian faith, this might not be at the forefront of your mind, but it really puzzled Augustine for a time, and that is the reality of evil. So he thought to himself, if there is a creator God who's all-powerful and brought everything into existence, how do we see evil in the world, and how are we drawn to it? I mentioned earlier that that philosophical tradition, or in some ways it was a religious tradition at the time of Manichaeism, and trained philosophers who are listening are probably going to throw something through the airwaves because I'm going to be very simplistic about this, but one way that the Manichaeans answered this question about the existence of evil is they said, like, there wasn't truly like an all-powerful God in the way that we understand God, but instead the universe was comprised of two competing forces. So evil was like a substance or a thing, and for a time, Augustine felt like that sort of solved this question about he had about creation and the evil that he saw around him. And so he applies this to his own life, and he like, as he's wrestling with the question of evil, he says, like, if I start from this position that God has created us for himself and that, like, we'll only be satisfied if we journey towards God, how is it that we so often choose what is evil or what harms us? And at one point he says, all those who wander far away and set themselves up against you, and again he's confessing to God, are imitating you, but in a perverse way. Yet by this very mimicry they proclaim that you are the creator of the whole of nature, and that in consequence there is no place whatever where we can hide from your presence. So Augustine, he's starting to get to the point, like zeroing in on the point that even when we sin, strangely enough, we're seeking a good. Like, we don't, it seems counterintuitive, like, if I drink too much, it's only harmful and it leads me to bad decisions, or, like, whatever the sin happens to be. But Augustine says, like, no, the person who sins, no matter what crime they commit, like, however heinous, like, they irrationally think they're pursuing some good. So, some people have pointed out, like, C.S. Lewis one time said that even the man who enters the brothel is in his own way searching for God. The person who commits suicide, like, they think the greatest good is that their existence will be annihilated, and so on. So Augustine says, like, with sin, we turn to these things, our desires are disordered, but we're still in a certain inchoate sense seeking God. And he extends this reflection with some of the sins in his own life. So one that he spends a lot of time on, and you'll find if you read Augustine, he can be a little obsessive about some things. So there was a period where he was running around with some ruffians, and like one of the petty crimes they were involved in is that they were stealing pears from one of the neighbors. And there's definitely some Garden of Eden imagery. Like, Augustine is always both like literal, like talking about things that have actually happened to him, but also drawing out great symbolism from what took place.
Oh yeah, and I think we need to deal with that in a whole episode. That's like book 2.
Well, yeah, but just to make the point, like, he's pursuing these pears, and with what he's already said about, like, a person pursuing what's good, he's like, but at the time I wasn't even hungry. Like, I didn't need to eat. Like, I was taking care of in my own household. So this one flummoxes him as well. And what he says is that he came to love just the transgression, like just the very act of doing the transgression. But since my pleasure did not lie in the pears themselves, it must have been in the crime as committed in the company of others who shared the sin. So again, this is the mystery of iniquity. Augustine's wrestling with, like, how do I make sense of the path that I've chosen if God's created me for himself? And he recognizes that part and parcel of his design, like in his DNA, is to know God, but he was settling for lesser goods. And as long as he was walking down that path, in some ways, like, time was eating up itself. Like, the further he went away from God, the less happy he was. And yet through it all, God was also, like, ready to tug the thread that would bring him back.
No, I think that's okay. That's great. And this passage I'm reading now is sort of the end of him doing the big introduction and where he jumps into talking about his life. But to your point, that it's this, there's already good in going after what is evil, but it's too small. Like, Augustine is the king of saying the problem with sin is its smallness, not its greatness. And so he goes, the house of my soul is too small for you to enter. make it more spacious by your coming. Which to me, if there's anything you would read before this that's more basic than the Confessions, it's like the letter to Proba on prayer, where he says prayer is about making the heart enlarged enough to receive the gifts of God. So he keeps going, my soul. It lies in ruins, rebuild it. Some things are to be found there which will offend your gaze. I confess this to be so and know it well, but who will clean my house? To whom but yourself can I cry, cleanse me of my hidden sins, O Lord, and for those incurred through others pardon your servant. I believe, so I will speak. You know everything, Lord. Have I not laid my own transgressions bare before you to my own condemnation, my God? And have you not forgiven the wickedness of my heart? That is the whole thing in a nutshell, is even in pursuing evil, we're after something true, but something too small. Our hearts must be enlarged for God. So this is The Uncommon Good. We'll be back right after this. Back with The Uncommon Good. Bo Bonner, Dr. Bud Marr joining you this week. Thank you for listening to the show. We love having our listeners, no matter how you happen to be listening, whether it's live on the airwaves, live over the internet at iowacatholicradio.com, through the Iowa Catholic Radio app, or via podcast. We have started our reading group, the first official one, Radio Reading. We need to come up with another R. Radio Reading Roundup. Yeah, I like it. The Uncommon Good Radio Reading Roundup on Augustine's Confessions.
Is Reading Rainbow taken? Roundup.
Yeah, we can even have like a little
cowboy boots,
lasso and things like that. Yeah. So we've not gotten far. So I hope you guys start to see the pace we're hoping to go to really help you guys chew on some of what's going on here. The intro, like we said, Bud, in our first long segment, might trick people because you go, oh, Augustine's just going to jump into autobiography immediately. But instead, he has a lot of questions. And the questions start to make sense if you start to realize. So one theory, not to get too far down the road, Bud, but I think one way to really help to read this is we're almost certain that Augustine wrote this either at the same time or relatively close to his book on Christian doctrine, which is his theory about how to baptize rhetoric. And what I mean by that is he was a rhetorician. To try to make sense of that, it's not quite lawyers, Bud, but it's sort of like that, right? There were people paid either in law courts or for public measures, basically to speak well, and through speaking well to convince people who are negative, like Augustine himself would say, manipulate people into following suit. So it's sort of like marketing and law and politics and the academic world all rolled into one in the ancient world. Augustine was this very famous teacher of rhetoric and was considered very highly for that regard. And so he wrote a book called On Christian Doctrine where he tried to purify rhetoric, and then it seems like he wrote Confession in line with it. So wherever this actually wrote out, it's clear to me, and you tell me if you feel this too, but in reading the Confessions, that Augustine on one hand is really prone to, like you said, be kind of obsessive about things that he saw wrong in his life, but also to try to utilize his life for the sake of the gospel. And part and parcel of this is his well-known talent at rhetoric. So we're going to get a lot of him hemming and hawing about classical education, for instance, and reading like Homer and things like this. And we're also going to hear him be really worried about the bad things that he wrought through being a rhetorician. But then he also seems very willing to put at the feet of the church his talent at rhetoric.
Well, we say that our faith is the theology of both and, that, God is both, or Jesus Christ was both divine and human. We're both free, and God is in charge of all things. I mean, we could go down the list. I think the saints they're particularly attuned to that. And so two of the saints who I admire most, St. John Henry Newman and then St. Augustine himself, I feel like they could look at a lot of life and see things from both sides, not in a relativistic sort of way. But what I'm thinking about with Newman is one time in a letter, like someone suggested to him that he might later be named a saint. He was like, no, like saints aren't bookish. They don't write novels. And he has in one of his sermons, he goes on this screed against novels and how they're sort of frivolous and they sway your emotions without producing real change in your life. And yet he wrote to himself, two books like that. With St. Augustine, like what he says about rhetoric, or I think about music. So at one point he says that to worship God through singing is to pray twice. but he was also attuned to the way that music could kind of sway our emotions, or like it could motivate us, like it could move our passions, basically. So he has certain warnings against them. I think he could have been like a monk in the right lifetime, and maybe, I do think he has a mystical bent, but sort of like we think of someone like St. Anthony or whatever, and yet he was willing. So, I mean, one way where I think is like sort of like physical evidence of St. Augustine's sainthood is that he was a pastor and bishop after converting later in life, and he would spend, we know, like hours during the day. Like at that time, bishops would really like even hear like legal cases and things like this. And yet the volume of what he wrote is, I've already used this word twice today, preternatural, where, if I sat down right now for the rest of my life with a pen and paper, I could maybe produce as many words as Augustine did. They would not be high quality. Everything that he wrote is like pretty much worth, like diving into deeply or whatnot. And so you're right, like with a book like the Confessions, Augustine, like he was trained classically in rhetoric. He saw its dangers, but he also used that gift to, I think, convert many souls.
So he has this quote where it shows him wrestling with this from the beginning. So this is sort of midway through that intro before we get into his actual life, where he's asking all these questions, like we said. And he goes, after saying all that, what if we said, my God, my life, and my holy sweetness? What does anyone who speaks of you really say? You're like, why am I going to keep reading the rest of your book? Then he goes, yet, woe betide those who fail to speak while the chatterboxes go on saying nothing. Hardcore burn, right? Like on Twitter, that would have been, fire emojis, right?
The saints have this way sometimes of just knocking the wind out of you. So when he writes his great work on the Trinity, I mean, really, like top 5 volume on one of the toughest doctrines of the Christian faith. And he gets done with like this 300-page tome of like great subtlety. And he says, like, with all that we've written, I don't assume for a moment that it actually unpacks the mystery of who God is, but we have written just so have not to have said anything, not to have said anything at all, right? So it's like you call confession out of us, and we have to like witness to the faith. But he does seem to have this like true. It reminds me of St. Thomas Aquinas at the end of his life saying his writings were as straw in comparison to what he experienced at the altar. So it is humbling as someone who like struggles to write a 10-page essay that I think like even 3 people should read.
Well, I mean, this gets at to why he thinks he needs to go on to confess about his life.
Yeah.
Because he goes, I want to talk about you. I want to answer these deep philosophical questions, which rhetorically is why he brings them up. How do I contain you? How do you contain the world? How do we in any way say that we have your life in us? He asks all these very deep philosophical and theological questions. And then he goes, we've said all this, but what we said is really nothing. But woe betide if we don't say anything at all. So what does he say he can say? That's what an English sentence. What does he say he can say? Alas for me, through your own merciful dealings with me, O Lord my God, tell me what you are to me. So this is interesting, Bud. He gets done making what is technically called an apophatic point, right? He proves something about God by saying what can't be said. We really can't answer these things. Who can? Well, luckily, you can, God. And this is what's so interesting, right, is that this entire time he's having this prayerful dialogue. So you're reading this and you're like, this is a guy narrating his life. But then you go, oh, the rhetorical setup is he is literally confessing to God.
Yeah.
And so we're in this position where we're not like the omniscient reader. It's like we're overhearing a guy praying out loud. And he means to do this, but it's an interesting perception for us to keep in mind as we read all this. And so here he is praying to God, oh, Lord, who's going to answer all this stuff? We talk all this amount, Lord, and we really say nothing, but we got to say something because otherwise idiots will keep talking. So he goes, who's going to say something? You will, Lord. So he goes, alas for me, through my own merciful dealings with me, your own merciful dealings with me, O Lord my God, tell me what you are to me. Say to my soul, I am your salvation. Say it so that I can hear it. My heart is listening, Lord. Open the ears of my heart and say to my soul, I am your salvation. Beautifully rhetorical, repeating that. Yeah. I am your salvation. I am your salvation. We have to open our hearts. We have to enlarge our hearts. We have to let him sweep the room. What are we doing? We're making our hearts prepared to hear the Lord say, what he is. And what is he? I am your salvation. And then, Bud, what is the rest of this? Of course, the Lord speaking through Augustine's life about how he is Augustine and our salvation.
No, I love the way that you put that. And the book really is like one long prayer. I had and that, what I'm thinking about, Bo, is like all of us have to pray the story of our life. That sounds kind of platitudinal, but like I remember a teacher saying to me once that without the church's liturgy, without the Mass, life would be one darn thing after another. Like it would have no coherency, no larger purpose to it. But when our lives are seen against the backdrop of what God is doing in and through us, then they take on this higher meaning. And so Augustine, he prays his own life, like he speaks it as a prayer. And in doing so, he's modeling for us what each one of us are called to do, even if, it may not be in a book form that like millions of people end up reading, but there's a way we can pray our life, even if we don't explicitly write it down. Another thing that I love about this book, Bo, is there's this misnomer, and you get this from a lot of like angsty college students where it's like, well, if you like accept a religious tradition, especially if you're Catholic, it's really sort of like flipping off your mind, turning off your mind. And like you're just accepting the answers of a fuddy-duddy institution or whatever, but you're not like critically thinking. And what you see with Augustine from the very beginning of the book is there's like no question that he's unwilling to tackle. And he comes at he grabs the nettles by the thorns. And so, like we think of like modern atheism as this like sometimes like cutting edge movement that's like finally willing to tackle the tough questions. Well, here, Augustine, in a book that we said is one long prayer, he wrestles with all sorts of things. So in book one, he's really sort of like, in some ways, I don't know if horrified is the right word, but he can see how when you look at reality in life, like some of it almost causes vertigo. So he looks back to like infancy and he says, like, there's a time where I was unbaptized, and that's like, it's almost kind of like horrifying for him that he lived so long sort of like outside the orbit of God's sacramental grace. And then secondly, he looks at infancy and he says, like, we always assume like infants are just like innocent and pure. And he's like, really, they just have a weak frame. But you see the influence of sin from a very early age. And he points out, like, for instance, like if you got two children who are nursing at the same time, I'm a twin, so this spoke to me. And they'll fight for their place even as they're nursing. So there's kind of like inherent selfishness. And so he sees these things and he's like, man, this can be like almost like disorienting and doesn't make sense to even confess a creator God. And yet he ends book one with thanksgiving. And he says, in spite of this, Lord, I give thanks and praise to you, the most perfect, most good creator. And what he's thanking God for there is the gift of being. He says, there's all these like rough edges to reality, but regardless, like we can't look askance that God has given us life. And like you said, the breath that allows us to confess who God is. And so he says, no matter where life takes us, no matter what circumstances we are in, we're reminded that the gift of being itself is the highest good because it means we can participate in the divinity of the one who created us.
Yeah, that is a perfect way to get at what he thinks, like being itself, that we need the gratitude. That gratitude is what then opens us up to understand our need for grace. But to revisit the twins at the breast one more time, I actually think this is a very comforting thing for young parents, because sometimes, right, we get this idea, and we're right to do so. Being a parent is a noble tradition, having kids in a world that doesn't seem to prize them, but we're sort of prone to act like raising kids is easy. You have a couple or so, I have my own brood, and it's nice to know that Augustine goes like, hey, look, when I'm saying there's original sin, what I'm not trying to say is that your child is secretly like a murderer or something. What he's saying is that even after they drink their mother's milk to cessation, like they're drowsy at the breast, to see another, right, the other baby begin to feed makes that other baby like rouse up and be jealous. And his point, and I think people overdo it with Augustine all the time, he doesn't always help himself, like he said, but sometimes he's overly dramatic about condemning things that he sees in his own life. I kind of think that's why he does a little bit too much of an imitation of Plato sometimes, who he really his favorite pagan author. Plato himself also will like bash the poets, but then he does so writing very poetically, right? That's part of the fun of their paradox. But what he's saying is not like this, original sin means that babies are just wicked and like, want to go gambling and knife people from very birth. What he's saying is the human condition after the fall is we're easily ungrateful, like the baby, right, doesn't have the sort of capacity to just be grateful that they've just ate to cessation, and then we're easily led astray by small things. Like that other baby who's getting their fill, that's great, right? The other baby needs to eat too, but sort of like even from birth, we kind of have this antagonism towards each other and can't appreciate the goods when other people are able to appreciate them as well.
Yeah, it's like almost to be born into original sin. There's all sorts of ways we could kind of slice and understand that doctrine, but part of it is that we see the other in a competitive manner. So from the very beginning, the presence of another, which should be a gift and a blessed thing, is not necessarily received that way because of like the web of relations that we've been born into. I don't want to reduce original sin to sort of like this systemic reality, but I think that's part of it for him.
No, I think that I'll be bold. I think one of the unfortunate consequences of the Reformation, one of them, there's plenty, is to read Augustine as solely seeing original sin as this sort of very personal, just twistedness, instead of what I think is this fundamental rivalry between others and ourselves and, of course, God, right? Original sin is about where there should be three intimate relationships, my relationship with God, my relationship with others, and my relationship with myself. There's now three rivalries, right? I have an antagonistic relationship with God. I have a rival, a mimetic rivalry with someone else, and then I'm divided against myself. That's what Augustine means by original sin, and in some ways that backs it off a bit, but then also makes it, so to speak, you start to understand why Augustine's so worried about it then. It's because it's not just this individual thing that like, oh, you're going to be a turkey and, not brush your teeth and dot your I's and cross your T's like you should. It's more, there's two cities now, the city of God and the city of man. And the city of man is based in this rivalry that we start to see even at infancy, says Augustine.
Well, and that gets us back to the point, I think, about evil. And so for our listeners, like this question of the problem of evil, it's not simply a sort of like interesting philosophical idea that we wrestle with so that people in Bo and myself can have jobs that we wouldn't otherwise have. It really does have theological heft. And what I mean by that is like, if evil is a substance or a thing that God somehow created, then I don't think we can be assured that God is victorious in the end. And there's a way in which God is not the God who we confess and worship. It's almost sort of like a trickster because the universe was sort of wound up in such a way that there's no way we could not fall. But what Augustine comes to see is that like evil, like I said with the example of the pears, it's not like this reality that he can grab a hold of and participate in. He describes it as a privation of the good. So evil is actually the lack of something, but because we have a free will, like we can choose to turn away from goods that God's actually given to us, and it leads us to a state. This is really fascinating to me, and it's an idea that comes back to me a lot. Augustine says the soul that settles into sin and that settles for goods that are lesser than God himself is a soul that's curved in on itself. And so he says, actually, the greatest punishment that God can turn us over to is the punishment of a disordered soul. So when we ask for God's grace and his blessings on our lives, we can ask for material blessings, and God as the giver of all good things, bestows those upon us in many different ways. But the grace that we should ask above all else is that God doesn't turn us over to our own sinful desires. And this happens not only at an individual level, but I think at a corporate level, where like really the highest form of punishment is for God to say, you're allowed to go your own way.
But this is perfect, because to land this ship and here in the beginning, this works out perfect. This wrestling with evil, and just Augustine wrestling, it gets to what I think is Augustine's subtle dialogue partner in nearly everything he does, and I have to thank Dr. Russell Hittinger, my mentor, who points this out. It's one more way in which what Augustine has in mind, Bud, is Job. and Job wrestling with evil and God. So like when we get this part where he's like getting done with the intro and turning to his infancy, he goes, I do not argue my case against you, for if you are truth itself, nor do I wish to deceive myself, lest my iniquity be caught in my own lot. But he goes here, yet allow me to speak, though I am but dust and ashes, which is what Job says to the God in the whirlwind. Allow me to speak in your merciful presence, for it is your mercy that I address myself, not to some man who would mock me. Perhaps you are still laughing at me, another hint of Job, but still you will turn mercifully toward me. For what is it that I am trying to say, Lord, except that I do not know whence I came into this life that is but a dying, or rather this dying state that leads to life? I do not know where I came from, but this I know, that I was welcomed by tender care your mercy provided for me. This is sort of Job asking God about evil, and God saying back to Job, where were you when I created the stars? And, so Job repents in dust and ashes. I would say that the best Old Testament sort of character to think about as we go through the Confessions is imagine Augustine trying to be a Latin rhetorically trained Christian Job, and the Confessions make a lot of sense. There's so much we're going to talk about, but I'm so pumped about what we're going to, but we need to go ahead and stop for this segment. This is The Uncommon Good. Bo Bonner, Dr. Bud Marr, Stick around. We'll be back right after this. We're back with The Uncommon Good. Bo Bonner, Dr. Bud Marr, joining you this week. Thank you for listening to the show. Bud, you got to run and do something else, so I'm just going to skip to your part. Okay. Bud, when people need to listen, when people need to pray with us here on Iowa Catholic Radio, what are ways they can do so?
Yeah, please join in our prayer life here at the radio station. So you can download the Iowa Catholic Radio app. That gives you access to our calendar, our events, like any sort of news associated with the radio station, but it also allows you to pray the rosary anytime, anywhere. To facilitate sort of like our communal life of prayer, we do broadcast the rosary at 6 a.m. and 10 a.m., and then later at 2:55 in the afternoon, the Chaplet of Divine Mercy is prayed on air. So a lot of great opportunities to plug into our prayer life.
Well, Bud, thank you for being a part of kicking off our radio reading roundup. I'm enjoying this way too much. But with
Can
St.
you
Augustine,
trill your R's?
Radio reading roundup.
No, I think I could sense the intercessions of St. Augustine. It was a great kickoff, a lot of fun. So looking forward to this new series.
Okay, we'll see you next week, Bud. Folks, you can continue listening to me. I know the main course is going, but this is like the dessert. I am appreciative of getting the chance to talk about St. Augustine's Confessions as we are, because a lot of times people think that to learn Augustine is to learn some sort of basics about the West, that if you get this right or if you don't have it, somehow you can't be a proper Roman Catholic Christian. But of course, what we're after is chewing on the difficult aspects of what it means to confess that our lives have grace threaded through them, much like Augustine does. So the benefit of being able to do something like read the Confessions and hear people talk about it and ruminate on it is to realize that the big takeaway is maybe not necessarily any one position Augustine explicates. For some of us, that might be the case, but what I can say for all of us is available when we ruminate, contemplate, meditate, all those words that end in ATE, when we read things together, is to know that asking questions of God doesn't have to be doubting or accusing God. Like I said, I think it's important to think of Augustine's hero of the Old Testament as Job. Again, shout out to Dr. Hiddinger for making that so obvious to me. He's meaning it in the city of God, but I'm starting to see it everywhere I read St. Augustine. Of course, Job is under absolute duress, and so his questions and chewing on the difficult questions with God is going to be more dark-hewn, right? Like he's had so many bad things that happened to him, he's really getting to the root of the problem. We don't have to have necessarily, maybe you are in that place in life, but even if you're not, we can take that time to ask God. Because remember, Job spoke rightly of God, other than, much different than his companions that were trying to make excuses for God. St. Augustine shows us what it might look like as a Catholic to enter into that Jobian mode and not misunderstand it as accusations against God, but to ask God to speak, to make sense of our questions that arise, because we, of course, on our own don't have the capacity to answer them or even see them properly. His life he gives to us in order to ask those questions. But we can do that through reading. That's, to me, what it means for us to read like we're chewing on what we're reading rather than mining it for answers. Let the text master us. Our goal is not to master the texts, but let Augustine, in many ways, read our lives. That's what we're up to. Look, folks, if you want to, like Bud has already mentioned, you can go to iowacatholicradio.com and click on events to see what's coming up. For instance, one on June 16th at 7 o'clock West Des Moines at St. Francis of Assisi. Rome Beneath the Surface with Deacon Omar Gutierrez, host of the Catholic Hour with the Evangelium Institute. There's all sorts of other ones. Go check that out there. And then, of course, it's your donations that make this possible. iowacatholicradio.com, Iowa Catholic Radio app, and 515-223-1150 to call or text to donate. This is The Uncommon Good. May Jesus Christ, the Prince of Peace, reign in our hearts, family, city, state, nation, solar system, galaxy, the whole kick and boodle. This is The Uncommon Good, and we'll be back next week.
The Uncommon Good with Bo Bonner and Dr. Bud Marr is heard every week on wonderful Catholic stations like this one, and anytime on podcast. Just search for The Uncommon Good.
Support for Iowa Catholic Radio and The Uncommon Good provided by Mercy College of Health Sciences. Learn more at mchs.edu.